So yesterday we looked at Psalm 22, 1 through 5 on our journey to the cross. And today we're going to look at Psalm 22, 6 through 11. And I cannot wait to share with you what I discovered a few years back when I was studying this psalm about a certain word in this passage. And it is so good. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But first, I want us to read Psalm 22, 6 through 11. Okay, Psalm 22, 6 through 11 says this, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me, they wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breast. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help." So this passage begins by David saying, "I am a worm and not a man." So just hold that thought. We'll come back to that. But in contrast to what we read yesterday, especially in verse 3, where he says, "Yet you are holy." So David focuses on God's holiness, and in contrast, he sees himself in contrast to God's holiness as a worm and not a man. And then he talks about trust again. Remember, yesterday we looked at how he looked back and remembered Israel's rescue and how they trusted in God. And we see that here, that he trusts in him, and he is scorned and mocked for trusting in God. And that is his focus here, but it's the contrast of God's holiness and who he is. I am a worm and not a man, or how he sees himself in contrast to God's holiness. We see this echoed at the cross too, where we see him scorned and despised and rejected by men. And then we see him completely place his trust in God by saying, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." And we feel that tension, don't we, in our lives, where we have that view of God, but in our circumstances, but then we see ourselves in that. And he goes to another yet I have trusted in you from birth. He's saying, God, you've been all I've had from the very beginning. You're the one that has ordained every single day laid out for me. And we see that too in our lives, that apart from him, we have nothing. He says, there is trouble and there is no one to help. He's saying, you're all I have. You're all I've got. Think back on Jesus's life, and especially in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he wrestled with his circumstances and who God is and the burden that was placed on him. And he willingly yielded his life to trust God completely, to say, God, not my will, but yours be done. So really what we're seeing here in this psalm is a picture of Christ suffering mirrored in David's suffering. And so much of this is seen at the cross. And so now we're going to come to that word worm. And I am just blown away by how God uses creation to paint a picture of what Christ accomplished on the cross. So the word worm, I thought it was strange when I first read this, and it says, I am a worm and not a man. And I thought, well, he could just mean I'm nothing. I'm nothing more than a worm. Just simply that. But no, because the word for worm, the typical word for a worm, a regular old worm, is maggot. In Hebrew, that's what it means. But the word in Hebrew here in Psalm 22 is a very specific worm. Okay, follow me here. So the scientific word for this worm is Coccus ilicis. Look it up, Google it. It is not a regular worm. It's a specific worm that is called a crimson worm or a scarlet worm. Let that sink in for a minute. So this crimson worm was actually used in that day to be crushed and dye fabric red. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this worm works in creation. So this worm, this scarlet worm, crimson worm, when it's ready to have offspring, it will attach itself to a tree or a post, something wooden, and it is so committed to this post that in order to remove this worm from the tree, you would have to like rip the worm apart, like it is stuck. And then the offspring, it would have the offspring, and they would be sort of hidden under this worm's body. And when the offspring hatch, they start eating the flesh of the worm. And at that time, the worm releases a red substance that dyes these offspring red. And then that worm will fall off of the tree and die and turn white. Okay, is your mind blown yet? There are so many connections here to just the use of this specific word for worm and a specific worm that I'm just blown away, because Jesus was committed. He was fully committed to the cross. He was not going to come down off of that cross. He was committed for us, because you know what? We couldn't do it ourselves. We couldn't rescue ourselves. We couldn't clean ourselves up enough. So he did it for us, and his blood shed for us cleanses us from our sin and covers us. I just love how God uses creation to illustrate a picture of what Christ accomplished on the cross, because he was committed. He was fully committed to God's plan, and he did it to absorb and appease the wrath of God for us, because we couldn't do it on our own. And what a beautiful picture of his redemption in Christ and on the cross through this tiny word called worm. So let this truth sink in today, that Christ was fully committed to the cross and to God's plan for us, because we couldn't rescue ourselves. We needed him to die for us so that we could be washed by his blood and cleansed from our sin, and God's wrath would be fully absorbed in Christ on the cross, so that there would be none left for us. So as we look at this psalm, and as we think about, maybe right now you feel like trouble is near, like David says at the end of this section, trouble is near and there is none to help. The only one that can help us is God, and we must trust him fully. He is our only hope. He's all we've got. Join us tomorrow, because we're going to dig more into this psalm to see what else God has to show us as we walk toward the cross. Tomorrow is Spy Wednesday. I'll explain a little bit more about that tomorrow and why it's called Spy Wednesday. But for now, sit with this psalm and the truth that Christ is fully committed and was fully committed for us, because we could not rescue ourselves.